Despite 4 people seeing her jogging down that road that day, no one saw Tim kidnap her. The DNA found inside Miss Stavik's body was Tim's. But as I'm sure you already know, evidence of sexual contact is not evidence of kidnapping. Evidence of sexual contact is not evidence of rape. And evidence of sexual contact is certainly not evidence of murder.
The defense argued that the DNA recovered from Mandy Stavik only proved one thing, that Timothy Bass had sexual contact with her sometime before her death. But for many people in the courtroom, that explanation still left too many questions unanswered. Mandy Stavik was an experienced swimmer who knew the area well. So how did an 18-year-old college student end up drowned in the Nooksack River only hours after disappearing? That question haunted the town of Acme for nearly 3 decades and pushed one detective to spend years searching for justice for a former classmate he never forgot. December 2017, Detective Kevin Bohe sat quietly inside the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office as the final DNA report was placed in front of him. For years, Bohe had been consumed by the murder of Mandy Stavik. He had attended the same high school Mandy once attended, and after taking over the investigation, he relentlessly chased every lead he could find. At one point, the case even led him halfway across the world to Cambodia, where he attempted to question a man rumored to know who killed her. But like so many leads before it, the trail went nowhere. Now nearly 3 decades after Mandy vanished, the lab had finally returned the result he had spent years waiting for. The DNA recovered from a discarded plastic cup and a Coca-Cola can was a complete match to the evidence collected from Mandy Stavik's body in 1989. Bohe broke down in tears. After almost 30 years, investigators had finally identified the man responsible for Mandy Stavik's murder. But to understand why that moment carried so much weight for Bohe and for the small community that had lived under the shadow of Mandy's murder for nearly 3 decades, we have to go back to Thanksgiving weekend in 1989 in the rural town of Acme, Washington. Because before Mandy Stavik became one of Washington State's most haunting cold cases, she was simply the kind of girl everyone in town seemed to love. Amanda Teresa Mandy Stavik was born on April 16, 1971, in Bellingham, Washington, to her parents Mary and Glenn Stavik. Shortly after her birth, the family moved to Palmer, Alaska. However, Glenn and Mary divorced just 3 years later in 1974. Following the divorce, Mary decided to move with 3 of her children, her daughters Molly and Mandy and her son Lee, to Acme, Washington. Acme was a very small town. In 1974, it had a population of fewer than 350 people. The move was prompted by Mandy's best friend moving there first. When Mary went to visit that friend, she fell in love with the area and decided to relocate the family. Mandy had an older brother named Brent, who chose to stay in Alaska with his father after the move. In 1975, only a year after the family had split up, Brent was tragically shot and killed while on a hunting trip in Anchorage. He had been shot multiple times in the head and chest. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, with no clear leads or known motives for the shooting. The Stavik family dealt with further tragedy in 1988 when Glenn's stepson, Spencer, drowned in a boating accident on the Kenai River in Alaska. He was 20 years old at the time. By 1989, Glenn Stavik had lost 3 children, all under the age of 21. Brent was 18, Spencer was 20, and Mandy was 18. Mandy attended Mount Baker High School, where she was known as a high achiever. One of her teachers described her as someone who wanted to do well in everything she pursued. Her list of activities was extensive. She was a member of the school band, where she played the flute, clarinet, and saxophone. She was an honor student who was also fluent in sign language and spoke Japanese. In addition to her academics and music, Mandy was a versatile athlete. She played basketball and softball, was a cheerleader, and enjoyed horseback riding. She was particularly passionate about running track. Her friends and family described her as bright, vivacious, and larger than life. Her high school basketball coach, Jim Freeman, became a father figure to her following her parents' divorce, mentoring her both on and off the court. Mandy once wrote him a card thanking him for being the person who inspired and influenced her more than anyone else, signing it as Mandy Stavik, class of '89, number 13. Mandy's mother, Mary, often remarked on how special her daughter was, describing herself as an ordinary person who didn't quite know how she managed to have such an extraordinary child. In 1989, Mandy graduated from high school and began attending Central Washington University, where she planned to become a commercial airline pilot. During her first year of college, Mandy returned to Acme to visit her family for the Thanksgiving holiday. On November 25th, the day after Thanksgiving, she went out for her usual jog. She was accompanied by the family's German Shepherd, Kira. Mandy typically ran the same 5-mile route from her family's home to the Nooksack River and back. Before she left for college, she had run this route every single day, and she continued the routine while home for the holidays. That afternoon, Mandy's brother Lee was at a friend's house when he saw Mandy running past on her way back home. She appeared to be finishing her jog, but she never arrived at the house. Approximately 2 hours later, Kira returned home alone. The dog was cowering with her tail tucked between her legs. Mandy Stavik immediately became concerned. Mandy was a very consistent person, and it was entirely out of character for the dog to return without her. Mary began calling everyone she knew, starting with Mandy's boyfriend, Rick. Rick and Mandy had dated on and off for 3 years in high school and had traveled back from college together for the holiday, but he had not seen her. Mary contacted the sheriff and organized friends and family to begin a search. Initially, they hoped Mandy had simply sustained an injury and was unable to walk home, but they found no sign of her. A massive search operation was launched involving police officers, volunteers, and bloodhounds. As the first 24 hours passed without any discovery, the situation became increasingly grim. Investigators began questioning those closest to Mandy. Her boyfriend, Rick, was cleared quickly. He provided an alibi and was fully cooperative with the investigation. Detectives also located the last person to see Mandy alive, a man in a pickup truck who saw her running past him toward her home. On the second day of the search, teams discovered a pair of green sweatpants on a side road. Mandy had been wearing green sweatpants when she left for her run, but analysis could never positively connect the clothing to her. On the third day of the search, a team of detectives, including lead detective Ron Peterson, took a boat onto the Nooksack River. It was during this patrol that they found Mandy's body floating in the water. She was wearing nothing but her socks and her tennis shoes. The section of the river where she was found was shallow. Because Mandy was known to be a strong swimmer, investigators ruled out an accidental drowning. The bottom of the river was covered in rocks and gravel, yet there were no signs of a struggle or any indication that the ground had been disturbed in that spot. However, Mandy had a significant injury to her head. Medical examiners concluded that she had been knocked unconscious before being placed in the river, where she subsequently drowned. Detective Peterson, who had recently completed FBI training in DNA evidence collection, handled the removal of the body with extreme care to ensure no evidence was lost. During the autopsy, investigators successfully recovered male DNA in the form of semen, which confirmed that Mandy had been sexually assaulted before she was murdered. Based on the evidence, investigators developed a theory of how the crime occurred. They believed the assailant had abducted Mandy using a vehicle, reasoning that she was too fast of a runner to be overtaken on foot. They suspected the kidnapper had used a gun to force her into the car, likely kicking the family dog, Kira, into a nearby ditch before driving away. The theory suggested she was taken about 3.5 miles away to a field filled with blackberry bushes. Mandy's arms and legs were covered in scratches, leading detectives to believe she had tried to escape by running through the thorny bushes before her attacker caught her, knocked her out, and drove her to the river. A memorial service was held for Mandy, attended by more than 1,000 people. In fact, there was no church in the area large enough to accommodate the crowd, so the service was ultimately held inside the same high school gymnasium Mandy had graduated from only months earlier. Her high school basketball coach, Jim Freeman, delivered the eulogy. The murder had a profound impact on Acme. Before this, residents had viewed the town as a safe place where people rarely felt the need to lock their doors or windows. The realization that a killer might be living among them replaced that sense of security with fear. As the investigation continued, police followed up on every tip they received. Many of those leads pointed toward a local drifter named David. Detectives interviewed him and obtained a warrant for his DNA, but the results did not match the evidence recovered from Mandy's body. In total, investigators collected saliva samples from roughly 30 men in the area, yet none of them matched the DNA evidence. Investigators explored countless possibilities, but none of the early leads brought them closer to identifying Mandy's killer. At the time, some detectives even considered whether Mandy's murder could be connected to the Green River killer case, which was still terrorizing parts of Washington state during the late 1980s. However, investigators ultimately concluded that Mandy did not fit the typical victim profile associated with the murders. Most of the Green River victims were vulnerable women, such as sex workers or runaways, while Mandy was an 18-year-old college student from a close-knit rural community who disappeared while jogging near her family home in broad daylight. Even so, the possibility that a serial killer might be operating in the region only deepened the fear surrounding the case. Eventually, the leads dried up. The case slowly faded into the growing stack of unsolved murders, but in Acme, Mandy Stavik was never forgotten. In the years after her death, the community raised thousands of dollars to create the Mandy Stavik Scholarship, which continued to be awarded each year to students involved in Mount Baker High School's music program. Friends and classmates also planted a memorial tree outside Sparks Hall at Central Washington University, where hundreds gathered to remember her. Even as the years passed, Mandy's murder continued to haunt the community. Rumors about possible suspects circulated throughout the valley, and many residents struggled with the idea that the person responsible may have been someone they had known for years. Over time, investigators identified several possible suspects, but none of the evidence was strong enough to support an arrest. Then, nearly 2 decades after Mandy's murder, advances in DNA technology gave investigators renewed hope. In 2007, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office began re-examining old cold cases using newer forensic methods, capable of analyzing DNA samples that had once been considered too small or too degraded to test. Detectives digitized decades of case files and resubmitted old evidence for more advanced analysis. Sheriff Bill Elfo publicly stated that investigators believed Mandy's case could still be solved and promised they would not stop until they identified her killer. 2 years later, Detective Kevin Bohe took over the investigation. Having attended the same high school as Mandy, Bohe felt a personal connection to the case and became determined to finally uncover who killed her. While reviewing old case files, he became interested in a man named John Wisniewski, a local drug dealer at the time of the murder who had reportedly claimed to know who was responsible for Mandy's death. In 2010, Bohe traveled to Cambodia, where Wisniewski was then living, hoping the trip might finally break the case open. But after hours of questioning, Wisniewski denied knowing anything useful. Once again, the investigation stalled. In June 2013, a new lead emerged from an unexpected conversation at a water park. Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, who had both attended Mount Baker High School around the same time as Mandy, were at the Birch Bay water slides with their children. Although they barely knew each other in high school, they found themselves sitting together in a grassed area while their kids played. During a conversation with several other mothers, the topic of Mandy Stavik was brought up. One woman expressed frustration that the case remained unsolved after more than 2 decades, noting how the murder had permanently changed the town of Acme from a place of innocence to one of fear. In that moment, Heather stated that she believed she knew who was responsible. Marilee immediately responded that she felt the same way. Despite never having discussed the matter before, both women realized they were thinking of the same person, Timothy Bass. Bass had also attended Mount Baker High School and was a friend of Marilee's husband. Neither woman had gone to the police in the years following the murder. In a small community like Acme, they had been hesitant to make such a serious accusation without physical proof, fearing the social repercussions. They were also motivated by fear stemming from their own personal encounters with him. Marilee shared an experience that had taken place a couple of years after Mandy's murder. She had been home alone with her infant while her husband was away on a work trip, when Tim Bass showed up at her door uninvited. Once inside, he picked up her phone and dialed a number, but Marilee could hear the beep of a disconnected line from the receiver. She realized then that he was likely using the phone as an excuse to remain in her house. Bass then walked through her kitchen and into her bedroom, where he began telling her he had always been in love with her and wanted to make love to her. Marilee was terrified and repeatedly told him no, but he refused to leave. It was only after she threatened to call the police that he finally exited the home. Heather's experience had occurred just a few months before Mandy was murdered. At the time, Heather was 15 and Tim was 21. They had gone to a softball game with a friend named Dan, who would later become Heather's husband. On the drive home, the three of them sat in the front seat of a truck, with Heather positioned in the middle. Bass began flirting with her aggressively, commenting on her eyes and rubbing a pen along her bare legs. The interaction made her extremely uncomfortable, but she tried to stay calm because Dan was present. When Mandy was killed shortly after, Heather's mind immediately went back to that encounter and the predatory behavior Bass had exhibited. Following the conversation at the water park, Marilee went home and called a friend who worked for the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. She shared both her own suspicions and Heather's unsettling experience with Timothy Bass. The information eventually made its way to Detective Kevin Bohe, who had been re-examining the case for years. As Bohe dug deeper into Bass's background, he uncovered a startling oversight in the original investigation. Timothy Bass had never once been questioned in connection to Mandy Stavik's murder. The discovery was particularly striking because Bass had lived on the same street as Mandy in Acme. Every time Mandy went for her daily run, she would have passed directly by the Bass residence. At the time of the murder, Bass lived there with his father and brother Tom. Yet despite investigators collecting DNA samples from dozens of local men in 1989, nobody in the Bass household had ever been interviewed or asked to provide a sample. The family was well-liked and respected within the community, and for more than 20 years, they had remained completely off investigators' radar. During the time the case remained unsolved, Tim Bass had been living a quiet life. In January 1990, just 6 weeks after the murder, he married a woman named Gina, who also attended Mount Baker High School. They eventually moved to Everson, about 19 miles from Acme, where Bass found work as a delivery driver for the Franz Bakery outlet. The couple had 3 children together. However, according to Gina, the marriage was a nightmare. She later told detectives that the relationship felt like a prison. She described Bass as emotionally abusive and highly controlling, dictating what she could wear and who she could speak to, and treating her more like a servant than a wife. His brother Tom corroborated these accounts, noting that he had seen Tim tell Gina to shut up more times than he could count. Gina had attempted to leave him once and even obtained a restraining order, but Bass threatened to lie to the courts to ensure she would never see their children again. Fearing the loss of her children, she felt she had no choice but to return to him. While detectives were learning about the reality of Tim's home life, they also discovered that he had a strange fixation on Mandy's case. Gina told police that Tim would frequently watch crime shows and documentaries about the murder. He would often comment on how stupid the murderer was for not covering his tracks and would remark that he wouldn't be surprised if the killer eventually got caught. It was a disturbing detail for investigators, considering the man they were profiling was effectively critiquing his own crime from his living room. When detectives first approached Tim Bass at his home to question him about Mandy Stavik, his initial reaction was to feign total ignorance. He looked up at the officers and repeated her name slowly, Mandy, 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 as if he were trying to place a distant memory. He eventually admitted that he recognized her as the girl found in the river, but maintained he had no personal connection to her. Given that Mandy had run past his house every single day and that her murder was the most notorious event in the history of their small high school, detectives were certain he was lying. The police asked Bass for a voluntary DNA sample, but he refused. He told them that he watched enough crime television to know how people could be sent to prison because of DNA, and he wasn't willing to take that risk. Unwilling to tip their hand or provoke him further, the detectives decided to obtain his DNA through surveillance. They followed him during his bakery delivery route, hoping he would discard a coffee cup or a cigarette butt, but Bass was extremely cautious and didn't throw anything away. The investigation then moved to the Franz Bakery outlet where Bass worked. Detectives met with his manager, Kim Wagner. Initially, the police were vague about why they were investigating Tim, asking only for his delivery routes. Wagner told them that Bass was a difficult employee with a short temper, who often got angry over small things. She also noted his blatant disrespect for women. He refused to call her by her name, referring to her only as woman. When the bakery's corporate office informed the detectives they would need a subpoena to release more detailed information, the investigation hit a temporary wall because the police didn't yet have enough probable cause to get a warrant. A short time later, Kim Wagner was out with friends when she mentioned that the police had been asking about Tim Bass. One of her friends pointed out that Bass had lived on the same street as Mandy Stavik at the time of her disappearance. For Kim, it was a light bulb moment. Everything she knew about Tim's behavior, his temper, his treatment of women, and his history in Acme, suddenly clicked. She became convinced that he was responsible for Mandy's death. When detectives returned to speak with her a second time, Kim was ready to help. She asked the officers directly if they wanted her to get a sample of his DNA. Legally, the police could not ask a civilian to do this, but they informed her that if she happened to find discarded evidence on her own, they could accept it. Kim began a meticulous 3-month stakeout at the bakery. She frequently changed the liners in the trash cans to ensure that if Tim threw anything away, it wouldn't be contaminated by other rubbish. However, Tim was exceptionally careful, likely aware of how forensic evidence worked from the crime shows he watched. He wore gloves at work to avoid leaving fingerprints and took all of his personal trash home with him at the end of his shifts. For 12 weeks, Kim watched him closely, but he left nothing behind. Finally, in late 2017, Tim slipped up. He drank from a small plastic cup at the water fountain and threw it in the bin. Later that day, he discarded a Coke can. As soon as he left the area, Kim's heart raced as she retrieved the items and locked them in her desk. The police sent the cup and can to the lab, and 3 months later, the results finally came back. For Detective Kevin Bohe, the moment carried the weight of nearly a decade spent chasing dead ends, failed leads, and unanswered questions. He had reopened old files, traveled across the world pursuing rumors, and spent years trying to solve a murder that had haunted his community since 1989. Now the answer was sitting in front of him. The DNA recovered from the discarded cup and Coke can was a complete match to the evidence collected from Mandy Stavik's body nearly 3 decades earlier. After years of uncertainty, investigators finally knew they had found Mandy's killer. Bohe and another detective returned to the bakery to confront Tim Bass. They asked him once again whether he had ever been involved with Mandy or if the two had ever even kissed. Tim again said no. At first, he appeared calm, continuing to distance himself from Mandy and insisting he barely knew her at all. Then Bohe asked a single question. How could your DNA have ended up inside Mandy Stavik? The shift in Tim's demeanor was immediate. He stopped denying the connection altogether. Instead, his attention suddenly turned to the investigation itself. He repeatedly asked the detectives the same question over and over again. How did you get my DNA? Neither detective answered. For Bohe, the reaction confirmed what years of investigation had been leading toward. Tim Bass was no longer asking the questions of an innocent man trying to understand why police were accusing him. He was asking the questions of someone trying to understand how they finally caught him. On December 12, 2017, just over 28 years after the murder, 50-year-old Timothy Forrest Bass was arrested in the Franz Bakery parking lot. He was charged with first-degree kidnapping, rape, and murder. Later that day, the sheriff visited Mary Stavik to give her the news. It was her 81st birthday, and she told the officers that the arrest was the greatest birthday present she could have ever imagined. During questioning at the station, Tim's story shifted dramatically. Once he realized his DNA had linked him to the crime, he abandoned his claim that he didn't know Mandy. Instead, he told investigators that he and Mandy had been secret lovers. He claimed they had started a relationship in the spring of 1989 after meeting while he was out riding mountain bikes with his father. He alleged that they had stayed in contact and that when Mandy returned from college for Thanksgiving, she had come to his house and they had engaged in consensual sex just hours before she was murdered by someone else. There was no evidence to support this. No friends, family members, or phone records could corroborate that the two had ever even spoken, let alone had a relationship. Mandy's sister, Molly, dismissed the claim entirely, stating there was no way Mandy would have been involved with Bass. The trial of Timothy Bass began in May 2019. He pleaded not guilty. His defense attorney, Stephen Jackson, argued the theory of a consensual relationship, suggesting that DNA evidence did not prove rape or murder. To support this, the defense called an expert witness, Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, who testified that the DNA could have been deposited up to 2 days before Mandy's death. This testimony was somewhat contradictory to Bass's own claim that the encounter happened just hours before the murder. The prosecution was led by Dave McEachran, a veteran prosecutor who had been 44 years old when Mandy was killed. Though he had already retired, he returned to the office specifically for this case and refused to be paid for his work. The prosecution's expert witness, Dr. Gary Goldfogel, the original medical examiner from 1989, stood by his initial findings. He testified that the physical evidence was consistent with Mandy being raped, murdered, and then drowned in the river, and he disagreed with the defense's timeline for the DNA deposit. Several members of the Bass family took the stand. Tim's brother Tom testified that after Tim was first questioned by police, he had tried to convince Tom to lie for him. Tim had allegedly asked Tom to tell police that Mandy had slept with him as well, in an attempt to portray her as someone who had multiple partners. Tom refused to lie. Tim's mother, Sandra, also testified, though she defended her son, stating she believed he was being railroaded by a community that wanted the case solved at any cost. Gina Bass also took the stand. When Tim was first arrested, she had initially provided him with an alibi, telling police she was with him the entire day of the murder. At the trial, she admitted that was a lie. She explained that she had spent decades living in fear of her husband and had only provided the alibi because she felt she had to protect herself and her children. Once he was in custody, she finally felt safe enough to tell the truth. She did not know where he was during the hours Mandy disappeared. She also revealed that Tim had even tried to get his mother to point the finger at his own father, who had died years earlier, to divert suspicion. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for just over a day before returning their verdict. 29 years and 6 months to the day after Mandy Stavik was murdered, Timothy Bass was found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as the underlying charges of kidnapping and rape. At his sentencing hearing in July 2019, Mandy's family expressed their decades of pain. While Mary and Molly were too emotional to speak, Molly's husband spoke on their behalf, stating that Bass should never again be allowed to walk as a free man. When it was his turn to speak, Bass maintained his innocence, claiming he had not received a fair trial.
I would first like to say that I'm 100% innocent of this crime. Furthermore, I don't believe I received a fair trial. In saying that, though, a better man in me says I should say very little today. I give this day to the Stavik family.
Even in his final statement, Bass still portrayed himself as the victim. And the phrase, "give this day to the Stavik family," almost sounded like one final act of kindness he believed he was offering them. Ultimately, the judge sentenced Bass to 320 months in prison, just under 27 years. This was the maximum sentence allowed under the law for the charges brought against him. The conviction was significant not only because the case had remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades, but because prosecutors faced a major legal challenge in proving exactly how the murder had occurred. Under Washington state law, prosecutors could have pursued a more aggressive theory of premeditated murder, which carried the possibility of a harsher sentence. However, that strategy also required proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Bass had planned Mandy's killing in advance, something investigators could not conclusively establish due to the age of the case and the lack of eyewitnesses. Instead, prosecutors focused on what they could prove with forensic evidence, that Mandy had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and ultimately killed during the commission of those crimes. The decision reflected a common reality in cold case prosecutions. After decades have passed, physical evidence may still survive, but proving a suspect's exact state of mind becomes far more difficult. In many cases, prosecutors prioritize securing a conviction over risking a total acquittal while attempting to pursue the most severe possible charge. Timothy Bass is currently serving his sentence at the Clallam Bay Correction Center under close custody supervision. He is scheduled for release in January 2036. Following the sentencing, Gina Bass remarked that while she had spent 28 years in a prison of her own with him, it was finally his turn to be behind bars. In the years following Mandy's death, the community of Acme raised approximately $25,000 for a reward fund. Since that money was never claimed by an informant, it was eventually turned into a scholarship fund at Mount Baker High School. For nearly 30 years, the Mandy Stavik Scholarship has been awarded to students involved in the school's music program, ensuring that Mandy's name remains associated with the things she loved, rather than the tragedy that took her life. Mary Stavik expressed a sense of closure after the trial, knowing that after nearly 3 decades, the man responsible for her daughter's death was finally facing justice. For Detective Kevin Bohe, the finality of the sentence brought a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. He had started this journey not just as an officer of the law, but as a former student of Mount Baker High who refused to let a classmate be forgotten. The case that had once taken him halfway across the world to Cambodia and had kept him awake through countless nights of reviewing cold files was finally closed.